Hello, this is America, where the US says it has won, or at least is winning, the war. Of course, Iran has got other ideas, but whose war is this to end? Is it America's? Is it Iran's? Is it Israel's? And does Tehran actually have more power here than Washington would care to admit? We're going to dig into that right now with me and Anna Burns-Francis.
Thanks, Phil. America's president's been keen to project power and influence in this war, but it's clear tempers are becoming more than a little frayed. In a moment, we'll be joined by our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett, and Manny Rapallo is at the State Department today. But first, it's a return to form for the war in Iran, a return to claims of negotiations seemingly underway, underlined by threats of devastation.
The entire country can be taken out in one night, and that night might be tomorrow night.
The president's confidence comes after the dramatic rescue of 2 US airmen from behind enemy lines last week and his weekend threat to unleash hell if Iran doesn't reopen a blockaded Strait of Hormuz. Expletives aside, the threat to bomb civilian infrastructure only raised the ire of Iran, which now says the situation in one of the world's most vital waterways will never return to its original form. The resolute messaging from the regime is nothing new. Presidents from Clinton to Bush to Trump version 1 all found a foe in Iran, but they never made it a direct target. And although the two nations have now been locked in a standoff lasting longer than the Cold War, this short conflict has been far more costly. The Strait of Hormuz is all but effectively shut, and the International Energy Agency is calling the fallout the largest energy shock in history. While allies wait to see what the outcome of the latest deadline and discussions are, many more are wondering just how the two countries will be able to negotiate any ending at all.
We have prepared our response. We will decide on the timing and manner of its announcement when appropriate. A nation that is guided by reason and knows what it wants, as well as what it cannot accept, has no hesitation in expressing its positions. However, negotiations are entirely incompatible with ultimatums, crimes, and threats of war crimes.
Each side's conditions for ending the war have been broadly outlined, and while Washington's list hasn't been exclusively published, it's clear there are major differences in demands. US media leaks suggest America wants a 30-day ceasefire, while Iran is calling for a complete halt to aggression and assassinations, and a guarantee against future attacks. The US wants 3 of Iran's nuclear facilities to be dismantled, for Tehran to never develop a nuclear weapon, and to stop the enrichment of uranium. Tehran says enrichment is an inalienable right. The reopening of the Strait of Hormuz is also a key US demand, despite claims it's not a war objective. Tehran says it needs a guarantee that Iran has sovereignty over the waterway. And the US also wants Iran to end its support for the likes of Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen. But Iran is demanding the US and Israel stop the war on all fronts, including fighting against those groups, which are its regional allies. Right, in a moment we'll go to Manny Rapallo at the State Department, but first let's go to Kimberly Halkett, who joins us from the White House. Kimberly, the President's been speaking this afternoon. Any update on those talks?
Yeah, the U.S. president indicating that negotiations are still ongoing and that he believes that Iran is negotiating in what he says is good faith. But as to whether the two sides can come to some sort of agreement to limit or prevent an escalation, the U.S. president would only say, we'll find out. Now, the U.S. president has given until Tuesday, 8 p.m. Washington, D.C. time for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and for there to be an agreement of some sort to limit its nuclear program. The U.S. president going further than he has before on Monday, saying that if that deadline is not met, he says that the United States will then destroy Iran's bridges, power plants, and that will happen approximately 4 hours after the end of that 8 p.m. deadline. So the U.S. president laying out the consequences if diplomacy fails. When asked by reporters whether or not he is concerned that this is a war crime, the U.S. president said he's not concerned at all.
A lot riding on this. Manny, I'll bring you in here. What is the view then from US diplomats who are trying to manage this crisis?
Anna, the U.S. effort when it comes to diplomacy is being led less by the traditional State Department channels and more by individuals and a small group of people within the senior leadership at the White House. We can point specifically here to individuals like U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, who has been relying more on back channels and not so much on the traditional path of negotiation here. With that said, there has been acknowledgement by U.S. diplomats that there is a big gap and a big difference between what the United States is hoping to reach and what Iran is hoping to reach here. They're very far apart when it comes to an agreement there. And this could be largely the reason why we're seeing a shift for more of an interim step here rather than a comprehensive plan. Now, the chatter that we're hearing from foreign policy circles here in Washington, D.C. is that both the U.S. and Iran are coming at this from positions of strength and not positions of compromise. And the longer that continues, the more we're going to see a scenario play out where there's only going to be a very small and a very narrow channel, a narrow space for a diplomatic deal here.
All right, Manny Rapolo joining us from the State Department. Kimberly Halkett, live for us at the White House. Thank you both. As President Trump looks for ways to end the conflict with Iran, failure by both sides to make concessions has seen the deadlock continue. John Hendren looks at the options either side has for an off-ramp.
President Trump insists the clock is ticking toward the end of the war in Iran.
That we are on track to complete all of America's military objectives shortly, very shortly.
But the timing of the war's end is hard to pin down.
When it's over, this is going to bounce right back so fast.
When are you going to know when it's over?
When I feel it.
Okay.
I feel it in my bones.
That leaves a colossal question unanswered. Who decides when the war is over? Iran says it does, with the country's consulate general in Mumbai posting, Iran will end the war at a time of its own choosing, and only if the conditions it has set are fulfilled. It will not allow Trump to determine the timing of the war's end. The U.S. has offered a 15-point plan, including demands that Iran dismantle key nuclear sites, permanently end uranium enrichment, hand over its stockpiles of enriched nuclear material, limit its missiles, and end regional proxy networks. Iran has its own plan, demanding war reparations, full control over the Strait of Hormuz, binding security agreements from the U.S. and its allies, and an end to all attacks on its regional partners. Trump now says he can end the war without an agreement with Iran. But if things don't change, that leaves the U.S. without control of the Strait of Hormuz, without controlling Iran's nuclear material, and with a change in the faces of the regime, but not its policies. And that has many Americans asking, what has the U.S. been fighting for? As those demands harden, the war itself is expanding, with Iran coordinating with its proxies across multiple fronts. Hezbollah attacking Israel from Lebanon, armed allies in Iraq, kidnapping an American journalist. Yemen's Houthi rebels attacking international ships in the Red Sea. Each new front raises the cost of a ceasefire and makes it harder to enforce, leaving mounting destruction. Meanwhile, thousands of U.S. Marines are deploying to the region, raising the prospect of a deeper and more dangerous phase of the war. As a coalition led by Egypt, Pakistan, and Turkey tries to broker a ceasefire, strategists on both sides question whether they can find common ground for an end to the war. John Hendren, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, President Trump has repeatedly insisted the US is winning the war. He's even gone so far as to say the war has been won. But Iran is still launching missiles, demonstrating that even though the US started it, it may not be in a position to end it. So, who has that power? Let's head back to Phil in the newsroom.
Yeah, a lot of talk here in the US media over who gets the final say. Can this war ever really reach a truce? Who gets to say that it is over? So we'll start with Axios. And look at the picture telling the story here, because you've got the Iranian flag and there, stuck, trapped in the middle, is President Trump. And that is where the headline leads into. Behind the curtain, Trump's escalation trap. Then it goes on to use a word we used to hear all the time from President Trump, not so much over the last month. Unlike tariffs that can be swiftly imposed and rescinded, the war's outcome is beyond unilateral control and quick fixes. And crucially here, look, Iran gets a say. Plus, there's more. Axios also saying Trump could pull out tomorrow, but the Iranians could keep the Strait of Hormuz closed and push oil prices so high that America would have to re-engage. Now, Axios has done a lot of reporting on this, so there is another article, and it says here, look, as long as the Iranian blockade holds and Gulf oil remains trapped, Trump can't end the war and declare victory, even if he wants to. Right, up next, it is the New York Times, not the news section, the podcast section. This is the Ezra Klein Show, and he was interviewing this Iran expert based here in Washington, D.C., and she was saying Iran feels it has got the upper hand here, but it probably won't end the war because it knows what could come next.
The Iranians want to ensure that they don't face yet another round of attacks, and so one of the concerns that they have about a potentially preemptive end to this war is that it will just be the prelude to another set of strikes. This is what they experienced in June of 2025, and they were waiting for the next round.
Right, next up, we're going to go to the conservative news outlet Fox News, and this presenter was interviewing these two commentators. This lady in particular had this to say. She said that President Trump has got the upper hand here, but she doesn't think he should negotiate an end, and here is why.
I'm not for any type of peace deal or treaty because at the end of the day, what do peace deals do? You can't negotiate with terrorists. We're giving jihadist-loving, American-hating terrorists an off-ramp. They deserve nothing. You can't negotiate with terrorists. And the worst part about this is Iran is still holding the Strait of Hormuz hostage.
Up next, it is the Wall Street Journal, and it quotes one former US top diplomat who was involved in the original nuclear deal as saying this, quite simple: this is the hill they, as in Iran, die on. And then the Washington Post opinion section says Trump doesn't need an Iran deal. It goes on to add this. It says, instead of waiting for Tehran to agree, Trump can declare victory and impose his will in 5 steps. And then it leans into this. Remember, this is the address that President Trump gave to the nation last week, and he used this specific term.
We're going to bring them back to the Stone Ages where they belong.
Back to the Stone Age. That is the simple response there. One word, good. And then there is more. It goes on to say Trump does not need a deal to end Operation Epic Fury. In fact, he is much better off without one. Whether the American public agrees, that is another matter, with gas prices through the roof, with the potential of troop deployment. Ultimately, this is a war that maybe neither side will actually ever be able to win, but both sides will want to be able to say they were the ones who ended it.
So, can the US or Iran trust a deal, and would it be adhered to? Recent history suggests maybe not. Iran agreed to restrict its uranium enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief in 2015 under the Iran nuclear deal. In 2018, Donald Trump withdrew the US from the deal, and last year widespread sanctions were reimposed on Iran. The two countries entered indirect talks with hopes to revive the agreement. But after 5 rounds of negotiations, Israel carried out strikes targeting military infrastructure. 3 days after that, the US attacked 3 Iranian nuclear facilities. Iran retaliated by attacking a base hosting the US military in Qatar. Indirect talks resumed again earlier this year, with Oman as mediator. And on February 27, Oman's foreign minister said a deal was within reach. But the next day, the US and Israel launched its assault on Iran. What's ensued since has been all-out war, but with promises it will all be over soon. For their perspective, we're joined now by Dennis Ross, former US envoy to the Middle East, and former senior US diplomat Alan Eyre, also a negotiator, we should note, from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Thank you both for coming in. Dennis, I'll start with you. Will there be a ceasefire before the end of the current deadline?
I have to give you an honest answer. I don't know. Anybody who says they know at this point is able to divine President Trump's intentions in a way that I think is hard to predict. Do I think there's a potential for a ceasefire? Yes, I do. I also see a kind of interesting parallel right now between when the Israelis and Hamas were dealing through mediators. The Israeli position was ceasefire. The Hamas position was a permanent ceasefire. We have a parallel today. We have mediators who are proposing a 45-day ceasefire. The Iranians are saying it has to be a permanent ceasefire. This really has to end. And here's this gap again, ceasefire versus something that's permanent. Each side wants something out of this. Each side wants to be able to claim victory. Pretty hard for both to claim victory. As a mediator, I can say usually what you're trying to do is you're trying to allow each side to have an explanation. Whether you call it victory or not, they have to have an explanation. This is probably not going to end unless both sides have an explanation. It's not hard to conceive of what it might be. President Trump says, all I ever really cared about was making sure they don't have a nuclear weapon, and we've set them back so they can't be a threat to their neighbors, and they're not going to be able to pursue a nuclear weapons program. And he says, and there's going to be a regime for the Straits of Hormuz. And the Iranians say, we have commitments that the U.S. is never going to do this again, sanctions are going to be lifted, and we're part of any arrangement as it relates to the Strait of Hormuz. So it's not hard to envision what the explanations on each side could be.
Not hard, but yet the 15-point plan, Alan, has been sitting on the desks, or proposed 15-point plan from the US rather, has been sitting on the desks for 2 weeks now nearly, and yet we don't see any outward progress from either party towards actually reaching a ceasefire or reaching a deal. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think both sides have put forward maximalist positions, paradoxically more maximalist than before the war started. And unfortunately, the regime in place now in Iran is more hardline and more militarized than the one that was there before the war started. So there's been no progress, partially because the distances are so far apart, partially because there's an intense war going on, and a lot of the people who would be devoting time to negotiations are devoting their time to avoid being killed on the Iranian side, and also because the two sides' goals, as the ambassador said, are so far apart, it's hard to get the process started, especially through intermediaries. You know, if you have two sides in a room and you lock the door, that's the ultimate petri dish for negotiations over time. That's what we did in the JCPOA without the door locking. But, you know, passaging messages through one of 7 countries, it's really hard.
Yeah. Dennis also referred to then some of the detail around that plan, and one of them being a demand for a ceasefire versus a demand to a permanent end. And I'll ask you this, Alan, before I come back to you, Dennis. Is it reasonable to ask for an end, a permanent end to the conflict at this point, or is the ceasefire the best Iran should be asking for?
No, Iran doesn't want a ceasefire. That's the problem. It's like matter and antimatter. The U.S. wants a ceasefire because President Trump realizes that the economic consequences of Iranian control of the Strait are just now starting to multiply exponentially. But that's the only or the main leverage that Iran has. So if you've got your opponent in a chokehold, you don't let him out.
Are you saying that they are putting forward an unreasonable ask deliberately because it cannot be an end to the hostilities? If Iran is saying you cannot attack anybody in the region, we want a permanent end to the war, that they are deliberately putting forth a position that is untenable or not acceptable to the US?
No, I'm saying we're offering something to Iran that it doesn't want. We're bombing them and saying this will force Iran to accept a ceasefire because they'll want it. Iran doesn't want it because that's relinquishing the leverage. And as the ambassador said, they want to not return to the status quo because then 6 months or a year from now, Israel and the U.S. could mow the lawn again. They want two things. They want some type of security structure that prevents this from happening again, and they want a source of income to help rebuild what they've lost.
Well, earlier today, Donald Trump suggested a more reasonable Iran was showing signs of progress.
They've made a proposal, and it's a significant proposal. It's a significant step. It's not good enough, but it's a very significant step. Could end very quickly, the war, if they do what they have to do. They have to do certain things. They know that. They've been negotiating, I think, in good faith. We've had total regime change. You know, the people there now are much more reasonable than the lunatics that you had in phase 1 and phase 2. They were lunatics.
More reasonable people, Ambassador Ross. Do you see that therefore leading to Iran making any concessions here, if that is the impression the president has?
I'm not sure that they're more reasonable people, but again, if you're the president of the United States and you're looking for a way out, then you're going to portray them as making progress. And by the way, that can be a justification for him not to act on the latest ultimatum that he's established, because now he would have a justification. Look, he's also saying that there's been regime change. There hasn't been regime change. But he's looking for a way to be able to say, okay, we've achieved what we needed to achieve. In the end, that may not be such a bad thing. This can't end, however, with the Iranians having the kind of leverage over the Strait of Hormuz that they have. This is not something that they ever exercised before. Now they're exercising it. It's impossible for the president to claim victory if they're determining who gets to leave, who gets to enter, who gets to export, who can import, who pays a toll to them, who doesn't pay a toll to them. This is one of the international choke points. You know, you're talking about 20% of the world's oil and gas. You're also talking about a significant part of the world's fertilizer that comes from there. If the Iranians literally can blackmail everybody else, there's no way the president can say this has been a success.
Can I come to that point? Iran has said the Strait will never return to its former state, especially for America and Israel. Alan, given the ambassador's comments just then, what does that make then of any negotiation if that's Iran's position, that it won't even go back to where it was before?
Well, first of all, let me belabor the obvious. When governments communicate during wartime, they're not necessarily just trying to transmit information. They're trying to influence events. So when Iran says something, when Israel says something, when President Trump says something, he's doing it almost kinetically. So, but yeah, what you said is correct, which is Iran has been decimated. They don't want to go back to one day before the bombing started because they've lost all three pillars of their traditional strategic deterrence. They found a new hyper leverage, which is control of the Strait of Hormuz. And they're not going to give that up, certainly not to get a ceasefire they don't want. They're only going to give that up if they can get security and income.
And so where does this leave the US? Because if I can just put it to you, there is some suggestion that there is already a de facto toll booth in place. We are seeing ships that are linked to France, Japan, Singapore, China and India passing through the Strait in recent days. Does that weaken US leverage in terms of negotiating a system for opening up the Strait?
I'm not sure that it weakens U.S. leverage, but it clearly strengthens the Iranian leverage because they're beginning, as you suggest, to create a different reality. And the longer that goes on, the harder that is to reverse. So the president is looking for a way to convince the Iranians he can impose even more pain on them, so it's in their interest to sort of give this up. They have a different threshold, a different pain threshold now. They're reading his language as an indication that he's the one who needs to end the war. In any case, they want to be in a position where they can say, hey, look, we weren't the ones who asked for an end to the war. We survived the greatest power in the world, the strongest military power in the region. We survived that. So they want to be able to present themselves as a winner. I would say this, there's something else that I find interesting, which most people aren't focused on. The regime in Iran is a regime that had no answer for the grievances that produced what we saw at the end of December into January. This is a regime that can't provide water. There's not things that are much more basic than being able to meet the water needs of people. Electricity, even though it produces oil and natural gas. A currency that has basically no value. Yeah. So none of those grievances, which was driving the Iranian public, do they have an answer for. They will be even less able to address some of those in the aftermath of this, even if they can get sanctions lifted and they have money coming in. The level of mismanagement, the character of corruption, I mean, the sheer nature of what they have to cope with in terms of what's been destroyed, it's going to be difficult for them to deal with any of that. For me, there's a paradox. The paradox is when this war ends, the basic inner contradictions within that system are going to have to be addressed. Yeah. Now, will the regime be able to deal with them or collapse right away? The answer is no. But if you ask me, does this regime have real staying power over the next 12 to 18 months? Will it produce an Iranian Gorbachev, someone who emerges as a way of, look, the way we can save the Islamic Republic is by making some fundamental changes? I think there's a possibility. Is there a possibility in the 12 to 18 months that you can have a change again from the public? Maybe. But as long as the war goes on, ironically, even if they're weakened in a military sense, they're not necessarily weakened in terms of their control.
Yeah. Alan, in the time that we have left, I want to talk to you about something that you will have some experience with. There is a third party in this relationship, and that is, of course, Israel. How does their position and what their objectives are come into any negotiation scenario between the US and Iran? Is it possible that there is a deal that Israel would also be bound by?
Well, I think the U.S. has the ability to influence Israel to accept whatever deal it accepts, but you put your finger on it, which is, unlike the United States, Israel has a clear goal of bringing Iran to a failed state or a near failed state status. Now, if there were a pro-Western, pro-Israeli government in Iran, that would be even better. That's the cherry on the sundae. But at a minimum, what Israel wants is an Iranian government so busy just preventing anarchy that it poses no threat whatsoever. They're one of the reasons this war started, because the Prime Minister convinced President Trump that there were discrete goals that were achievable with a minimum of effort. That proved not to be the case. But yes, President Trump will have to use his influence with Israel to enforce any deal he makes with Iran.
Can I just add to that?
Very quickly, yes,
I'll do it very
please
quick.
do, yeah.
Prime Minister Netanyahu cannot say no to Donald Trump, period. And he won't.
Ambassador Dennis Ross, Alan Eyre, thank you both for coming in.
Thank you.
Trump's violent rhetoric on Truth Social set off the debate on social media once again. Alex Baird has this roundup.
Trump's 1987 bestseller, The Art of the Deal, his
Second favorite book of all time,
came to life this weekend with this. Negotiations with Iran pushed to the edge. Open the expletive strait, you crazy expletives, or you'll be living in hell. Former Trump supporter and far-right radio host Alex Jones taking the temperature of the room.
We've never seen rhetoric out of presidents like this when we go to war, even if you're for this war. This is really bad PR, folks.
Trump's rhetoric pushing that conversation online as to whether a deal is even possible now. Axios saying that nth-hour negotiations are in full swing, despite sources saying the chances of success are slim. The updates coming in real time. Speculation that opening the Strait of Hormuz is off the table and that for Iran the trust is beyond damaged. The response from Iranian embassies going viral that we've lost the keys to the strait and Iran finally got regime change, but to MAGA. The president a few days ago saying, well, if he can't get the Iranians on side, that won't be on him.
So if it doesn't happen, I'm blaming J.D. Vance. If it does happen, I'm taking full credit.
But the biggest theme online, confusion, narratives and objectives changing day by day, and the American public struggling to understand what's actually going on. Some saying, if that is the case, why would Iran even bother agreeing to a deal just to get attacked again 6 months later? Podcaster and former Fox host Tucker Carlson saying all the noise points to one thing.
And so you're watching the end of the global American empire.
The question now, what next?
That was great, by the way, while it lasted.
That's all from the team here in Washington, D.C., looking at the opposing demands between the US and Iran and who has the power to end the war. On This Is America, we'll keep following the decisions that shape the US and influence the world. For now, we'll hand back to Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha. Thanks for joining us.